The Association for the Rights of Catholics in the Church was started in 1980. It's very erratic, isn't it?
Yes.
And it was started in the wake of the Vatican declaration that Hans Küng could no longer be considered a Catholic theologian. The reason why that unusual move was made was in 1934 there was a concordat, meaning a treaty between the Vatican and Nazi Germany, arranging that when a professor was going to teach in a Catholic theology faculty at the university level, and that's the only possibility there was in Germany, he, and it was then only possibly a he, would have to get the permission or the mandatum from the local ordinary to teach in the Catholic theology faculty at the university. And so Hans Küng, along with all the other faculty members, got such a mandatum. And so apparently someone in the Vatican struck upon the idea that they wanted to cut down on the influence of this terrible person, Hans Küng. And so they thought if they could issue a document from the Center of Catholicism, Freudian slip, saying that he is no longer considered a Catholic theologian, well, then they could tell the local bishop that he would have to go to the Ministry of Religious Affairs at this local state, Land of Baden-Württemberg, and say, well, I'm very sorry, I have to withdraw permission for him to teach Catholic theology, which is what they did. And the result was, of course, he used to have 150 students or so who come to each of his lectures. The result was, immediately afterwards, there were at least 1,500 that came all the time. I've been sending my books in frequently, asking them to please condemn one or other. I guarantee Bishop Geoffrey that if his book is condemned, he can come here and he'll have lots of students. I'm not going to say anything more except to say that we, ARC, the Association for the Rights of Catholics in the Church, are extremely pleased to be able to sponsor this lecture this evening and the whole day of lectures and discussion, debate, and hopefully decision-making tomorrow. I hope all of you and all of your friends and maybe even your enemies would come tomorrow, because we need to make peace with our enemies, not our friends, to our session all day tomorrow. It's going to be in the building immediately next to us, starting at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. A little later, ARC will also present Bishop Geoffrey with the Hans Küng Award for Rights of Catholics in the Church. But right now, I want to introduce the person who has been the major organizer of this whole project, without which it never would have occurred. He is also a board member of the International Board of the Association for the Rights of Catholics in the Church. He's also a member of Voice of the Faithful, and he probably belongs to some other secret clubs I won't mention. His name is Charles McMahon, and he is going to introduce the bishop.
Thanks, Lynn. Is this everybody here? A little bit of administration here. Voice of the Faithful and CTA Philadelphia are also part of the sponsors of this as well. Lynn mentioned cell phones. The word didn't get around that we were selling the book at cost, which is $16. So if people have paid more than $16, you get a refund. After Bishop Robinson's lecture, we're going to pass around index cards to anybody who wants them. And if someone has a question, just jot it down on the index card, and we'll take some selection of those, maybe 4 or 5, for response by Bishop Robinson after the lecture. And the rest of them you can ask tomorrow. We'll give them to him, you can address them tomorrow in the review sessions. Now, feeble introduction, I'm going to let him be introduced by Bishop Pat Power, a colleague of his from Canberra, Australia, who gave a speech at a national conference last year. And so what I'm going to tell you, what I'm going to say is excerpts from Pat Power's speech. One leader who has listened to and remained in touch with his people is Bishop Geoffrey Robinson, the retired auxiliary bishop of Sydney. Having entered the seminary at the tender age of 12, he was later sent to the Propaganda Fide College in Rome for the completion of his seminary studies, and he was ordained to the priesthood in 1960. Although he has degrees in philosophy and theology and a great love for and knowledge of Scripture, it is his doctorate in canon law that gave direction to much of his priestly life, where he made an immense contribution to the life of the Australian Church in matrimonial tribunals. Here, he listened to heartrending stories of people seeking annulments of their marriage. Stories that not only related to a broken marriage, but very often were lifelong sagas of misfortune and deprivation. In his tribunal work, he did much to promote the Church's ideal of justice tempered with mercy and compassion. He was ordained a bishop in 1984, and his advice and guidance were sought out by his brother bishops on a whole range of issues. He was chosen to represent them at 2 worldwide synods of bishops and a number of other international forums. But his major contribution came in the late 1980s, when the Church first began to be aware of the horror of sexual abuse within its ranks. By the mid-1990s, it was becoming obvious that immense damage had been done to a significant number of people at the hands of Church personnel. Geoffrey Robinson exerted a brave leadership role in helping the bishops and the leaders of religious orders to address these issues. The publication Towards Healing, which gave the procedures for responding to complaints of abuse, and the publication Integrity in Ministry, which was a code of conduct for clergy and religious, were the principal documents produced as part of the Catholic Church's response to this terrible chapter in its history. I do not have to tell you how far-reaching have been the consequences of abuse within the Church, and indeed in other parts of society. Bishop Robinson's newly published book, Confronting Power and Sex in the Catholic Church, is a brave exposition of what the author judges to be some of the root causes of abuse. He sees this crisis as an opportunity for the whole Church to read the signs of the times in thoroughly re-examining whole areas of its life that are in need of reform. He pleads for open and honest discussion, painful though it might be. Ultimately, he recognizes that it is the truth that sets us free. In no area of church life should we back away from the hard questions. At this point, we're at a time of challenge and risk, but also of great hope and opportunity. Bishop Robinson would be telling his old colleagues to face up to this moment with courage and confidence, and in a spirit of dialogue and mutual trust. This is what Bishop Pat Power of Canberra said in Coffs Harbour, 11th of September, 2007. So please welcome Bishop Geoffrey Robinson to Philadelphia.
Now I'm switched on, Bishop. Good evening to everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here. Let me start in a most unusual way with a tiny bit, I promise, of canon law. There is a canon in the code which says that Christ's faithful are free to form associations, and they need nobody's permission to do so. They are free to come together and to discuss what needs to be discussed. And I am here responding precisely to such an invitation. It was Charles McMahon who wrote to me, told me about Voice of the Faithful, and what he told me responded very much to my own feelings. And so I was as happy to accept the invitation and to be here. The book that I had written began its life as a response to the revelations of sexual abuse within the church. And that is what the entire book is about. For the 9 years, from 1994 to 2003, I was first a member and then chairman of the committee set up by the Australian bishops to coordinate a national response to abuse. I spoke literally with hundreds of victims, both individually and in groups. I spoke with offenders, I worked with bishops, religious leaders, and for 9 years it completely dominated my life. There were many failures, but I like to think there were also some successes. It was an experience that changed me in so many ways that even if I wanted to, I could not go back to being the person I was before. And out of all of this came the conviction that if ever we are to look to the future with a clear conscience, there must be profound change within the church. Firstly, there must be a study of the more immediate causes of abuse. And there I have suggested that we need to study 3 things. Unhealthy psychology within individuals, unhealthy ideas concerning power and sex, and unhealthy living conditions. I believe it is when these 3 elements come together that there is created that murky world out of which abuse arises. And we must, in a particular way, look at all institutional factors in the church. By that I mean factors that you're subject to simply by being within this particular institution or by holding a particular position, for example as a priest or religious within that institution. We need to look at the institutional factors that may contribute to lack of health in any of these 3 areas. And we must be ready to make radical changes wherever they are needed. Secondly, in looking at abuse, we also need to look with equal seriousness at the inadequate response to abuse. For this created, as you well know, as much scandal or more as the abuse itself. Now, I do not believe that in the ceremony of the ordination of a bishop, there is, with all that laying on of hands, as it were, a microwaving of the bishop's brain. And I know that the many bishops I have worked with are not malicious. It's not enough, therefore, to blame individual bishops. The solution doesn't lie there, implying that they're all either incompetent or malicious. That simply isn't true. We must rather look at why so many good and intelligent people did not act as we might have hoped or expected. And in doing that, we once again must look at the institutional factors that were at work on those individuals and that led to the poor response. Thirdly, it is my belief that these two areas of inquiry, the immediate causes of abuse and the inadequate response to abuse, these two will inevitably lead to a third, namely to all aspects of the two subjects of power and sex in the church. And in particular, we must once again look at all aspects of both power and sex as parts of institutional thinking and practice. Sexual abuse, after all, is all about power and sex, and many would say more about power than it is about sex. So to counter abuse, we must be free to ask serious questions about power and sex in the institution of the church. Without this freedom, we would be attempting to respond to abuse while handcuffed and blindfolded. So taking firstly the question of power. The issue is complex, but I'll point this evening, in this brief talk, to two factors. The first can be summed up in the misunderstanding of a sentence in the letter to the Hebrews, where it says, "Every high priest chosen from among human beings is put in charge of things pertaining to God on their behalf." Now, the Greek text says simply that one human being, exactly like the others, is chosen for this job. So you have 100 people there, one of them is taken from those and given this specific role. But the Latin translation that was used, well, for many centuries, from the time of St. Jerome right through to a few years ago, the Latin text translated that as every high priest taken up, assumptus, taken up from among human beings. And that led to the idea of a mystique of the priesthood, and to a lesser extent of religious life, as somehow taken up. So you've got the same 100 people, 99 are left there, one is taken up above the other 99. Taken up on a pedestal, no longer like other human beings. And this is exactly the kind of unhealthy idea that I have in mind, that can contribute to abuse. And indeed, sexual abuse is only one form of the abuse that can arise from that idea, that I'm somehow taken up. It can lead to all kinds of abuse. Obviously, it can lead to abuse of authority in many different ways. One or two of you may even have met that somewhere. It's never easy to change an ethos or a mystique, but this ethos must change, for it denies the essential humanity of the priest or religious. And so it establishes a whole series of false relationships at the heart of the community. Priests and religious are ordinary human beings. Now that ought to be the most obvious statement in the world, that both priests and religious on the one hand, and Catholic people on the other hand, have much work to do in this field. I find that wherever there are priests or religious trying to climb down from the pedestal, it's not just church authorities, but many Catholic people who insist that they climb right back up again. There is that most dangerous insistence that priests and religious ought to be perfect and will be severely criticised if they're not. And if they can't actually be perfect, they must at the very least appear to be perfect. An extraordinary number of people even today, believe the naive idea that priests and religious are celibate, so they don't really have sexual desires and feelings the way the rest of us do. It's extraordinary the number of people who believe that. The second factor that I'm going to mention under the heading of power is that of papal authority. We know that the doctrine of infallibility states that the Pope cannot be wrong on a matter solemnly proclaimed, the Latin phrase ex cathedra. But gradually, over centuries, the protection of that ex cathedra level has meant that other levels also had to be protected. For example, the encyclical Humane Vitae on contraception does not use the language of infallibility. And yet, so much papal energy over so long a period of time has been invested in condemning artificial contraception that to say now that all those popes were wrong would be seen as striking a massive blow against all papal authority. Indeed, one may say that the widespread rejection of the teaching on contraception over the last 40 years since that encyclical has already had this effect. As more and more people have said, I am convinced that the Pope is wrong on this subject. So how do I know he's right on other subjects? And it's led to a lessening of respect for all levels of papal authority. In the same way, most popes have rejected the very idea of women priests, and to accept it now could be seen as admitting that 2,000 years of popes have all been wrong. So when pressure arose to discuss the matter, it was instead upgraded to a level where infallibility entered the question, and even discussion of it could be forbidden. Is church teaching condemning homosexual acts infallible? No. But it would be defended as though it were infallible, because once again, papal authority has been so heavily committed to it. What about all teaching on sex? Well, there may be room for movement on some more minor aspects, but not on the core teachings, because yet again, papal authority has been so heavily committed. Move a step lower. The law of priestly celibacy is no more than a law, and yet to change it now could imply yet again that 1,000 years of popes have been wrong. And once again, so much papal energy has been invested in this law, and such heavy measures were taken to enforce it, that even to change a mere law could affect papal authority across all fields. As a result, we have seen protectors of papal authority conclude that since all of those popes cannot have been wrong, therefore celibacy cannot be a significant cause of sexual abuse. And they would find another scapegoat. And as you know, the one they found was priests whose sexual orientation is homosexual. Now this kind of argument will never discover the truth, for it is not merely mistaken, and it is mistaken, but more importantly in a way, it's an avoidance of the truth in order to protect papal authority. Can you see the point I'm making about how it's all come down, and we can't even question something way down the list, let alone the things at the top. There is another factor that must be considered, even though in this case it's no more than a cultural factor. One does not have to be long in Italy before hearing the two terms bella figura and brutta figura. Now literally they mean a beautiful figure and an ugly figure, but their real meaning can be expressed in English by the phrases keeping up appearances or appearances matter. This idea was already powerful 2,000 years ago in the Roman Empire. Different phrase, but the same idea. There is, of course, some truth in the idea. For who of us could live without appearances? I mean, we all do it. I'm doing it right now, so are you. We all use appearances matter to all of us. But it's obvious that the idea is wide open to abuse, for it involves an instinctive tendency to hide and deny anything that creates brutta figura or does not create bella figura. And when it is added to the need to protect all levels of papal authority, it becomes a most dangerous idea. Before they are ordained, all bishops are required to take a special oath of fidelity to the Pope. Not to God, not to the Church, fidelity to the Pope. This oath is a symptom of the constant and severe pressure on all bishops to protect all levels of papal authority and even the bella figura of the Pope at all costs and in all circumstances. In other words, a very high value is put on a bishop being a Pope's man. And it was this pressure that led me to a very personal conflict between my duty of loyalty to the Pope and my duty of loyalty to that portion of God's people that the Australian bishops had assigned to me, the victims of abuse. It was the conflict between being a Pope's man and a victim's man. And at all times I would love to have been both. But I feel I was forced to a conflict. The conflict became a genuine crisis for me when I was simultaneously dealing with my own abuse, which had come to light for me, and on the other hand with the fact that the Pope of those years gave no real leadership in relation to abuse. He was silent. And he failed to do anything with the two cases that he alone could deal with. The Cardinal Archbishop of Vienna and the founder of the Legionaries of Christ. And I could not be a victim's man and a Pope's man at the same time. Now, there is 1,000 years of history behind the system I have described, and it constitutes a powerful and deeply rooted culture. And to change a culture is one of the hardest tasks known to humanity. It would be like taking all of you Americans and turning you into Mexicans. And that's a lot more than learning a language. As you well know, it's a change in culture. It's very difficult indeed. In the book I sum it up by saying that the Church freely gave up its right to be wrong. And you just can't do that. You can't survive, not an individual and not an institution, without the right to be wrong. I hope that these few thoughts, give some idea of why in responding to abuse, it's essential to go well beyond the immediate causes of abuse itself and the immediate response to abuse, and to look seriously at all ways in which power is understood and exercised within the Church. Turning to the second question, sex. There was a big sign, I remember, it was great, about as big as that back room. Sex across the middle. And down the bottom in tiny letters it had written, now that we have your total and undivided attention, would you please not drop your cigarettes on the floor? So I have your attention. In the Old or First Testament, two principles had great importance in relation to sexual relationships. That not alone, but they dominate. Firstly, the principle of property, or ownership, by which the wife was the property of her husband. And secondly, the principle of ritual purity, by which many things and many actions were considered to be ritually clean or unclean. Now there are other elements concerning sex in the Old Testament. There is love, for example, beautiful phrases. But these two, in sheer volume, dominate. Property and purity. Now Jesus abolished the principle of property when he made the quite revolutionary statement that a man could commit adultery against his wife. That idea did not exist until Jesus stated it. For this meant that she was not his property. He actually subverted the whole basis on which society, not just Jewish society, the whole world, it was based not on the individual, it was based on the family. And the family was based on the idea of the man in charge and the rest his property. Jesus subverted that, and Christians were faced with the near impossible task of changing that whole society at a time when they thought the world was about to end. He also abolished the principle of ritual purity when he said that nothing that enters the body from outside can make a person unclean. Now, the problem for the early church was that having abolished these two principles, Jesus did not spell out what he would put in their place. This is very important. Jesus abolished the two principles that had dominated, but did not spell out what he would put in their place. As a result of this absence of specific teaching on sex by Jesus, something of both the property ethic and the purity ethic remained in Christian history. And you can trace them through Christian history right down to our own day. How often does it happen, for example, that it must happen here? It must. I know it happens often enough in Australia. A man murders his wife and children because they've left him. And that's the property ethic coming right back again. The purity ethic, very much there too. In relation to sex, then, the major substitute that the church found was the idea of what is natural or unnatural. And it actually took that from a Jewish philosopher, Philo of Alexandria, and took up that idea. It led to the idea that every natural act of intercourse had to contain both a unitive element, the love and mutual support of the spouses, and a procreative element, openness to new life. To use the sexual faculties when either of these elements was not present was considered unnatural. And importantly, it was considered a direct sin against God because it was going against a divine plan and a divine intention. This led, I believe, to unhealthy consequences. It meant that even thinking about sex was a sin. And because it was a direct sin against God, every sexual sin was mortal. Now this made many people despair of avoiding mortal sin and give up on the moral life. Most important of all, I believe, was that it encouraged the idea of a most angry God who would consign a person to an eternity of punishment in hell for a single sexual thought. There are elements here so unhealthy that when put together with an unhealthy psychology and unhealthy living conditions, they can easily contribute to abuse. Furthermore, in placing all the emphasis on the sin against God rather than the offence against the abused minor, these ideas were a direct part of the unsatisfactory response to abuse. An offence against a minor was treated overwhelmingly and often exclusively as a sexual sin against God, and hence to be dealt with in exactly the same manner as any other sexual sin. This meant confession, total forgiveness, and restoration to one's former state. And this was a significant part of the motivation for the practice of moving priests around from one parish to another. Indeed, to argue for a sterner response, even today, can still lead to the accusation of being lacking in the essential Christian virtue of forgiveness. If you're not willing to put the priest back in a job, you're not forgiving. The problem is overcome only when, in forgiving a past wrong, we also see the necessity to take all precautions to prevent future wrong. And we will do this only when we place the emphasis not on a direct offence against God, but on an action deeply offensive to God because of the harm caused to innocent children. In other words, I do not believe that God gets upset by sexual desires or acts in and of themselves alone. Please don't quote the first half of that sentence without the second. I do not believe that God gets upset by sexual desires or acts in and of themselves alone. But God gets very upset by harm caused to other people, especially to innocent children. In relation to sex, I believe that the first question we need to be asking is not whether it is harming some natural order determined by God, but whether it is in any way harming either another person or the community or even oneself. I also suggest that not harming others is not enough. For if Jesus did not spell out the details of what he would substitute for the two ethics of property and purity, he did give the overriding principle when he said, love one another. Loving my neighbour, rather than merely not harming my neighbour, must be the true Christian criterion of morality in this field. Nowhere in any of the Gospels do I find Jesus saying, do not harm one another. It's included, of course, but his constant phrase was love one another. Yes, this principle needs to be spelled out in many ways, just as the Ten Commandments spell out what loving one another means in various different fields. It emphatically does not mean that if you feel even a transient liking towards someone, you can do what you like. At the very least, it means putting the other person first, as all true loving seeks to do. Whenever I speak on this subject, I always feel a difficulty at this point, for the matter needs to be thought about very carefully and cannot be expressed in one 7-second phrase before a television camera, which is the way so much of our society works today. Before anyone quotes me on this subject, I ask them to pay me the respect of reading carefully the entire chapter 10 of this book to see what I'm saying and what I'm not saying. I have called sexuality a turbulence and a whirlpool, for it is a place where the three powerful streams of basic instinct, rational thinking, and serious emotions all meet and crash together at times. It can do great good or great harm. And there are many different ways in which the harm can be caused. And so, in the book I ask the question, may we ask whether a sexual act is morally right when positively it is based on a genuine love of neighbour. That is, a genuine desire for all that is good for the other person, rather than simply self-interest. And negatively, contains no damaging elements, such as harm to a third party, for example, a husband or wife, any form of coercion or deceit, or any harm to the ability of sex to express love. I go on to ask, is the question of when these circumstances might apply, and whether and to what extent they might apply even outside marriage, one for discussion and debate by both the church community and the wider community, and then for decision before God, other people, and one's own deepest self by each individual. I do not believe that we can exclude the very possibility of sex outside marriage, for there are so many different circumstances that can occur. But I would personally be conservative on this point. I believe that the interplay of sex and love is so subtle that a person who would seek sex outside marriage has the burden of proof to establish that no harm is being caused and that it is a true act of loving the other person first. I believe that if the church moved away from a sexual morality based on direct offences against God towards a morality based on persons and relationships, we would finally be basing our sexual morality on the Gospels, rather than on a theory of what's natural or unnatural that actually doesn't come from the Gospels in any way, but from outside it. We would all have a healthier basis for our understanding of sexuality and for living our lives as sexual beings. How do we bring about change? Because I've written this book, people are constantly saying to me, well, this is all very well, but how do we bring about the changes you speak of? Allow me to give an answer in 4 parts. The first is to say quite candidly that change will be most difficult, for we are trying to change a culture, and the defences of that culture are 1,000 years old and rock solid. Those authorities that have condemned my book appear to be saying that in responding to abuse, we may not even ask questions about church teaching concerning either power or sex. We may investigate contributing factors within individual offenders as much as we like, but we are not free to talk about institutional factors that may have contributed to abuse. We may ask questions concerning why an individual bishop did not respond well, but we may not investigate institutional factors that affected all bishops. As long as such limitations are imposed, the Church will never respond adequately. For any serious and objective study must be free to follow the argument wherever it leads. At the same time, these considerations show why changing a culture will be a formidable task. The second element is that confronting bishops will not achieve change. And here I may be saying something unpopular to you, but it is my... And I'm not being defensive of bishops here, I'm saying something I believe profoundly. The major changes we seek cannot at present come from any other source, or any source other than the Pope. And we must be aware of the relative powerlessness of the bishops before the power of the papacy and the Vatican systems that support it. I suggest that we must therefore learn to work with the bishops rather than against them. It will be a lengthy process in which we engage them in conversation, gradually show them that there are problems in the culture they have been living in, and that the new culture we would like to introduce to them has a real beauty and freedom in it. The title of my book is Confronting Power and Sex, but it is a confrontation of issues, not of people. It is always easy to look for the quick solution, and the forms of democracy that you and I are familiar with encourage us to think in terms of a quick solution through confrontation and litigation. But that is why I have been at pains to describe a culture that has had 1,000 years to put down extraordinarily deep roots. The third part of my answer is that we need to have this conversation not just with the leaders, but as widely as possible among all members of the church. The greater the number of people involved, and the clearer people's ideas are concerning the church of the future, the more chance there is of bringing about such a church. I was greatly impressed by a phrase of Mahatma Gandhi that I read. We must be the change we wish to see in the world. We must be the change we wish to see in the world. And the church I wish to see is a church of conversation, not confrontation. So that is the church we must be now. The final part of my answer is that I believe that the best way to engage reluctant leaders in conversation is actually through the issue of sexual abuse. For the scandal of abuse has been so great that it is arguably the one issue that has the energy to do something as powerful as change a culture. You need massive energy for that. And it seems to me that sexual abuse, more than anything else, has that energy. All church leaders have at the very least been through a profound humiliation and embarrassment over this issue. And deep within them, they all know that on this issue, the popes have not given the courageous leadership that the church needed. However much they may pretend to the opposite, all leaders also know that we still have much to do before we can face the future with a clear conscience. I feel there is much room here for fruitful dialogue. In particular, parents have an obvious concern for the protection of their children, and no sincere leader should refuse to discuss this issue with them. So provided it's done in a spirit of conversation rather than confrontation, may I suggest a number of issues that can be raised in such a conversation. Now, here I'm making the supposition we're talking with a reasonable person, but let's start there. There are reasonable bishops. Believe it or not, you may not believe that, but there are. What I'm doing is talking things that I feel I could get a response. And here, take my experience. I've been a bishop for all those years. I have some understanding of how they think. And I'm not going for everything that you might want. Sometimes it's a first step. But my consideration each time is, what do I really feel I can get a bishop to respond to? So I'm speaking for you now. We have been so profoundly shocked by the revelations of sexual abuse that our faith in the church itself has been damaged. In addition, as parents, we are concerned for the protection of our children, and we feel that as yet, not nearly enough has been done to ensure their safety into the future. We believe that Pope John Paul II should have handled the two cases of Cardinal Greux and Father Degolado promptly and openly. Indeed, we expected a far stronger lead from the same Pope at the very beginning of the crisis, calling the whole Church to model itself on Jesus and respond with humility, honesty and compassion, insisting that the needs of victims be put before the good name of the Church, and in general, being the rock that holds the Church together in a time of crisis. He gave such strong leadership in so many other fields that the absence of adequate leadership in a field that affected us so deeply left us confused. Despite the welcome statements made recently in the United States by Pope Benedict, we believe that there is still a need for a public and formal apology directly to victims made by the Pope in St. Peter's Basilica, surrounded by the cardinals, assuring victims that they were not guilty of any fault because they were victims of more powerful persons who abused the spiritual power that the Church had given them. Apologizing for any ways in which teaching, structures or attitudes within the Church may have contributed, and assuring them that the Church will investigate all aspects of the matter in order to ensure that others are not abused as they were. We are by no means satisfied, however, that the Church is in fact doing everything possible to uncover the causes of abuse and to eradicate them. We believe that as a first step, there is a need to study all the ways in which Church teachings, attitudes, laws and practices contribute to unhealthy psychology, unhealthy ideas, and unhealthy living conditions for priests and religious. We know that celibacy is not the sole cause of abuse, but we also know that it is impossible to say that it has made no contribution. We wish to see a particular study of this matter, especially of the ways in which an unaccepted, unassimilated and unwanted celibacy can contribute to unhealthy psychology, for example severe depression, unhealthy ideas, for example misogyny, and unhealthy living conditions, for example loneliness and lack of support. Looking beyond these immediate issues, we believe that no study will be adequate unless it looks at all matters relating to power and sex within the Church. For example, the idea of priests and religious being taken up, the need to protect the good name of the Church at all costs, the inability to look at issues surrounding abuse in a fresh light because of the fear that any questions raised might harm papal authority. The idea that abuse was primarily a sexual offence against God rather than offensive to God because of the harm caused to innocent children. The need to distinguish between forgiveness of past wrong and prevention of future wrong. We have been most unhappy with the overall response to abuse by Church authorities at every level, and we ask for an investigation of why this was so. In particular, we ask for a study of any and all institutional factors that may have contributed to the inadequacy of the response and to such practices as the moving of offending priests from one parish to another. We believe that part of the problem was that each diocese and each religious order responded separately, so that the overall response was most uneven, and the whole country inevitably ended up being judged by its worst cases. We believe that the means must exist whereby the whole country can respond as one in times of crisis. One single good and holy man, Pope John Paul II, was unable, for whatever reasons, to respond adequately to this crisis, and the whole Church suffered as a result. We believe that the ideas of collegiality and the sensus fidei of the whole Church, both proclaimed by the Second Vatican Council, should, as a matter of urgency, be given concrete form in specific structures that, had they existed, would have enabled a coordinated and far better response to abuse by the whole Church. And finally, we know that there are very large numbers of sincere and devout Catholics who have serious problems with many Church teachings concerning power and sex. We feel that these Catholics are so many and so sincere that they deserve honest conversation on these topics, rather than the imposition of authority or condemnation. And finally, a new Church. In pursuing the two matters of power and sex in response to abuse, I came to realize that I was also setting out something of my own vision of the Church and what it is capable of being. Quite deliberately, therefore, I included the subtitle of Reclaiming the Spirit of Jesus. And I've been gratified by the number of people who have told me that the book expresses many things that they've been thinking for many years, and it simply helps them to articulate their own beliefs. Taken in this sense, the book is something that I've been writing for the last 50 years. It's an expression of the long journey that I and countless others have been making over those years, as we gradually moved away from a number of the attitudes and ideas of that time and instinctively sought to journey towards something more healthy. An early title that I thought of giving to the book was Nothing So Ugly, Nothing So Beautiful. This is based on a letter that John Henry Newman wrote to a friend a year or two before he took the step of joining the Catholic Church, and in which he said, "There is nothing on this earth so ugly as the Catholic Church, and nothing so beautiful." In the midst of the revelations of sexual abuse and of many of the grubbier details of the response to abuse, the Church was so ugly that outsiders turned away in disgust, while insiders felt a deep shame and confusion. I know I am speaking mainly to people who have not left the Church, and they have not left because they have seen and experienced the beauty of the Church, and they still love that beauty. If you cannot see the ugliness in the Church, you are closing your eyes. But if you cannot see the beauty, you do not know the Church. If I have personally encountered some of the ugliest things in the Church in the story of abuse, I have also been privileged to experience some of the most beautiful things, not least in all those people who have been ready to get down into the mud and the filth in order to help people. Despite some of the reactions there have been to my book, it is emphatically not an attack on the Church or a desire to cause it harm. On the contrary, it comes out of an intense desire to see a better Church, a Church in which everything that is humanly possible has been done to abolish all forms of abuse. A church that encourages growth through freedom. A church in which there is conversation rather than confrontation. A church in which all, women as much as men, laity as much as clergy, share equally in the full life of the church and can grow to become all they're capable of being by reclaiming the spirit of Jesus. I want to see a new church for a new millennium.
Right now, we're going to pass out these 3x5 cards, and if you have a question that you would like to write, ask Bishop to address, hopefully this evening, if we can't get to the ball, then tomorrow. And in the meanwhile, while this is happening, Professor Ingrid Shafer is going to read and deliver to Bishop Geoffrey Robinson the ARC, the Association for the Rights of Catholics in the Church, award, Hans Küng Award of Rights in the Church. Professor Shafer?
Yeah, just going to have to switch roles for a minute. So.
Bishop Jeff, you represent the very best for what art seeks to encourage with the Hans Küng rights of Catholics in the Church wide. We honor you today because of the man you are. A man of faith, hope, love, wisdom, integrity, and value, and valor. You have faith in a God of love and justice. You have faith in the people of God, a living, growing pilgrim church that offers life to the whole world and the whole cosmos. I'm quoting. You see the church, our church, manifesting itself primarily in what you call the Great Tradition. Those who love Jesus most profoundly and authentically experience God's eternal plan. You have faith in the wisdom of the Second Vatican Council, which within the Church reduced clericalism and supported the principles of collegiality and subsidiarity, while challenging the Church to engage in respectful egalitarian dialogue with the modern world, affirm the primacy of conscience, support human dignity, and promote religious freedom, are anathema, according to the First Vatican Council, which gave us the Fortress Church and papal infallibility, along with the demand to maintain the pious illusion of always being right, leading to endemic institutional hypocrisy. Like John the 23rd, you have faith in humanity and are ready to read the signs of the times in order to help the Church remain open to the Spirit that keeps urging us on to experience the ascent to, I'm sorry, I can't read my own writing, it's too small. Glasses. to separate the essential from the, where am I? Okay, urging us on to separate the essential from the incidental, or even harmful, such as pervasive misogynism and autocratic structures. You realize that the time has come for the people of God, lay and ordained, to liberate the church, we love, from the self-imposed prison. That cannot happen without courageous bishops who stand up and speak out. You are such a bishop. We hope you will become a role model and beacon for others. In the final meditation of your book, you tell of the song Jesus sang, the kind of haunting melody that, once heard, is never forgotten. A song at times soft and gentle, and at times so powerful that his voice filled the universe. It is clear from your life and work that you have not only heard that song, but have allowed it to transform your soul. You have consistently followed that inner voice which, according to St. Thomas, ever calls us to love and do what is right, no matter what the personal consequences. For these and a myriad other reasons, the Association for the Rights of Catholics in the Church bestows on you the 2008 Küng Rights of Catholics in the Church Award.
Man, I wish I had used my students. They never ask any questions.
So we're going to shuffle these, and the rest of them can be addressed tomorrow. So because of the... Are these empty? Oh, okay. They're easy to answer.
Answer that question.
They may be most difficult.
Why don't you start with that one, Bishop, and we'll go through some other pieces.
The first question reads, what can we do when the Pope and bishops refuse to enter into such a conversation? There's one among you I can't see at the moment, Richard Taylor, who has written a book not from time in libraries, but from working with Martin Luther King and others, and he learned the lessons of how to confront, and how even confrontation is to lead back to conversation. And no matter how confrontation it needs to get, the aim is always conversation. I would reply to this by saying, don't give up so easily. Sorry, it's not meant to be offensive, but don't. I mean, if I don't know the American bishops, I know the Australian ones. If there was a vote on who's in favour of this book that I've written, it'd be a minority. The majority would say, well, we have problems with it. But if you ask me how many of them are reasonable, I would certainly say most. I would think of, there's 42 bishops there. There wouldn't be more than 10 whom I would have to say, I don't know how to talk with that person. The mind's made up. The other 30 I believe I could at least talk to. And so that's where I'd start, because I would argue that if I can talk to all 30, and if at the end of that time I can see change in those 30, then collectively we can approach the other 10. At least that's the way I would see it. I wouldn't want to say, I wouldn't want to go to this question, what do we do when they refuse to enter into conversation? I would want to do everything first to have the conversation. With your knowledge of how bishops think, I'm not sure they would agree with that. Can you suggest methods, language and approaches that would most likely be received with an open mind and be a basis for starting dialogue? I'll go back again to what I've said. I think the issue of sexual abuse is your best entree to a discussion with the bishop. If you are straight off to discuss with him democracy in the church, you're not going to get far. If you say, look, we are parents, we're grandparents, we have little children, and we want to talk about that, then I would hope that there's your entree. And once you've got it, then it's up to you. As I've said, I don't want to see you confronting the bishops. You need the bishops. I mean, the best example is right here. Pope Benedict came to this country and he at least addressed the question of abuse. Now, why did he do that? Because I'm guessing here, but I'm 99.9% certain, because the American bishops collectively said to him, if you don't address it, don't come. It's so important that if you don't address it, we're left nowhere. And the Pope saw that and did address it. Now, why did the bishops do that? Because the people had first said that. So the process, to that extent, worked. And that's the process I think we need to continue with. So my answer to this straight question is through the issue of abuse. It's better than any other issue I know to get conversation on the things you want to. How do you foresee changing the papacy to reflect the ideals of Christ? Power and wealth are concentrated in the office of the papacy, over which the Pope may be powerless. That's a good point at the end. How free is a Pope to change all that round him? It's very difficult. See, it's very difficult for a Pope, any Pope, to stand up and say, all my predecessors were wrong. You know, imagine putting yourself in his shoes and say, all my predecessors were wrong, I alone am right. That's very difficult at any level at all. You know, even in the most like you know, talk about a Pope resigning when, say, for age or ill health. But are you aware, some of you I'm sure are, the last Pope to retire, Pope Celestine V, Michelangelo put him in hell on the wall of the Sistine Chapel. And that's a pretty powerful thing, you know, maybe a painter, not a theologian, but he was a very powerful religious figure, and he put Pope Celestine down in hell because he dared to retire, to give up the burden that God had given him in that attitude. So even that is, I mean, this is a good point. Don't presume that it's easy for a Pope to change things, but he's still crucial. And if he wants to change things, instead of trying to do it himself, what he needs to do is call in then, firstly the bishops, it's going to be that. If the Pope's not listening to the bishops, he's not going to be listening to the faithful. So please be in favour of collegiality, because, I repeat, if the Pope is not listening to the bishops, it is most unlikely he'll be listening to the laity. But he'd need to do that, talk with them first, and then change might be possible. How do I foresee changing the papacy? This will be, that's where the dialogue needs to be finally, with the Pope. That's why you need the bishops with you. That's where the defences are rock solid. The last Pope we mentioned, Pope John XXIII, who was, I was a young man, and I met him 3 days after I was elected. Cardinal Gilroy was in, he took me up, and the first papal words, he took one look at me when I was introduced. I was very young. And his first words to me was, "Et senza baffi," no beard. These words no doubt infallible. And I was taken with them, and you know, as so many of us of that generation were, how Pope got that slip through, but unfortunately now they've taken steps to make sure another Pope John does not come along, by selecting the cardinals who will elect the kind of... You address the powerlessness of the bishops. I hear this statement from you, but know firsthand that the bishops we know do not want to work with us. They will not allow conversation. In fact, they turn conversation into confrontation. Please address this and the fact that they will not even allow clergy in their own diocese to speak up. You know, this is true. I have to come back to what I've said. Of the 40 bishops in Australia, there are 30 I can talk to. So I would really, I mean, I'm not going to talk about the United States, I don't know them, but I would query this statement. They, the bishops, we know, do not want to work with us. They will not allow conversation. I query whether that would be true of, you know, 3/4 or more of all your bishops. That it's true of a lot of the most powerful, yes. That it's true certainly of a significant number, yes. But that it's true of most, I would need convincing. As I say, I know it's not true of my own country. There would be some who would be in distinct sympathy with what I'm saying. There would be others who would not, but who are reasonable people. I could talk to them. I could at least raise questions. I could at least ask them a question, are you satisfied the Church has done everything possible and that it needs to do to respond to abuse? You know, before God, are you satisfied? And I believe that 3/4 of the Australian bishops would say no. Well, there's a start. Then I can go on to conversation. So I'm sorry if I'm not answering the way you might hope, but I do believe conversation is possible. Call me naive, but that's my belief. Is the presentation available in written form? Just one problem with that. I'm giving, about 14 talks around this country. This is the first. And it'll be basically the same. I fled away from the idea of thinking up 14 completely different talks. So I'm giving this talk, and I suppose my fear is it goes straight onto an internet or something like that. Yes, the other 13 venues have all got it, and they're saying, why bother going to listen to it? We've read that. So that's just my, as to going too far. But can you answer, is it available to those here in written form in some way? Yeah. Or what?
Yeah, when the trip is finished, then you would make it available.
Or is it available on the internet?
Yeah. When it's finished.
Yeah.
When it's finished.
So are you happy with that when the trip is finished? Rather than see, I don't get to the final one in San Francisco in a month's time. Well, it'll be all over the countryside then. So when the trip's finished, it will be made available.
In the meantime, buy the book.
Yeah.
Buy the book. Buy the book.
Yeah, let me just say that, we're videoing this, the whole conference tomorrow as well. And the goal is to make the whole thing available on the internet. We would hope downloadable for nothing. And we'll, try to make DVDs for people who don't know how to download things.
And I plan to put the little things on YouTube. But again, I will wait until you have finished your tour.
But in the meantime, buy the book.
Yes.
Buy the book,
Right.
yes.
In the meantime, buy the book.
Is not the failure to have any division of power such as civil governments have a primary problem? Yes, I hope I've said that tonight. Far too much power is concentrated in the hands of one person, the Pope, in a quite unhealthy manner. And too much energy is put into propping up that one figure and the bella figura of that one figure, so that we may never criticise. I mean, for some church leaders, even the things I said about Pope John Paul this evening, that's heresy, or not heresy, it's certainly terrible disloyalty. I dared to criticise a Pope. actually not for what he did, but what he didn't do. You know, the leadership that did not come. Yes, there's too much power concentrated in one person. I mean, that is a very, very central problem altogether. You related the moving of priests round to forgiveness. Most I've spoken to something I can't get, it's relating to the Bellefield Board. Could you find that?
You related the moving of priests around to forgiveness. Most I have spoken with related to protecting the Bella Figura. Could you comment?
It's both. It's both. The one about forgiveness involving being restored to the job you had, or its equivalent, is certainly been part of it. I mean, I won't give a name, but one of the top cardinals in the Vatican accused me of lacking in forgiveness because I wouldn't go along with that idea. Forgiveness meant being restored to the position. So, you know, that's definitely part of it. But the Bella Figura, yes, I don't deny that. That's also been part of, you pretend the problem's not there. Are you able to have meaningful conversations on this topic with any of your fellow bishops at this time? Well, yes. When I was coming here and I accepted the invitations, I wrote a letter to the bishop of each diocese where I would be going. And I said, I'm coming. I said, I'm not asking your permission, but I'm paying you the courtesy of letting you know I'm coming. Now, some of the American bishops promptly sent this off to Rome, to the Cardinal Prefect of the Congregation for Bishops, Cardinal Giovanni Battista Re. And he, I know, my Archbishop, Cardinal Pell, had been in contact, they're great mates, and he'd been in contact with Cardinal Ray from the beginning. So, anyway, there was agreement that the Australian bishops would make a statement, which they did. And timing, I'm not going to make accusations here, they had their conference just before I left home. In fact, they were still in conference when I got on the plane. So they put out the statement, and I got it, the last minute before I got on the plane to come away, which has made it impossible for me. I mean, what I want to do is talk to some people in that whom I know are close friends of mine and say, what happened in the meeting? What was said, who led it, how did that statement come out? Because I have certain problems with the statement. I don't know whether you've seen it or not, but I find it quite problematic. At one stage, seems to say that the presence of the Holy Spirit in the Church is the same as papal infallibility, which is hardly quite true. And a few other things. It's okay. Thanks. So I have problems, a number of problems with that statement. I would want to know what went on there. And I know the ones who would agree with what I've said. I know the ones who would disagree. I know the ones who would have led the push for that statement. And I know the others who would have found this very difficult, including some of the much younger bishops who would have wished this hadn't happened, that they hadn't been placed in this position. So I'll have to handle all of that when I get home, is about as much as I can say. How would you suggest getting a conversation started with our bishops? As the parent of a gay man, our support group has
requested a conversation with Cardinal Regali to no end. We are not even
granted an acknowledgement of our letters or requests.
We are a group of Catholic parents. He must have taken that course in seminary where you don't respond to letters.
He's very aggressive behavior. He's very busy.
cardinal in Australia years ago, who always responded to every letter, but his answer was, in some cases, dear so-and-so, your letter has been received and the contents have been noted. Yours sincerely. Well, at least it was a response. Look, one or two comments on this. I've been talking about the issue of sexual abuse, and I've suggested that that one has the energy to get a conversation started. Now, if I got such a conversation going, I would at this stage restrict it, say, to the sorts of questions I've asked there which directly relate to abuse. If you're the parents of a gay man, then you are deeply concerned with that question. But I'm going to suggest that if you try to bring that in on a conversation about sexual abuse of young people, you're going to change the whole conversation. And you're going to get... Sorry, I really don't want to comment on a particular individual, so we'll take it away from that, okay? And I don't know him, by the way. I don't know Cardinal Rigali, never met him. Let's take some other bishop. If you bring in the issue of your gay son, then you're likely to get, the whole conversation stopped. In other words, you're going to have to say to him, I have a gay son, I want to talk with you about that. I'm suggesting, in other words, don't try to put everything into the one conversation. And I'd also add, don't try to achieve everything in the one conversation. You want to start a conversation. You're not going to change anyone in one meeting. Not on a subject like this, not on anything. Can I just add this? Because you're all from Philadelphia and his name's been brought up. Cardinal Rigali does listen to victims. I know that. I've been told that by a victim. And he said he got a good hearing. He didn't say anything changed, but he did say the man sat and listened. And that the little comments he made show that he was listening. So, I'm not going to draw any conclusions. I just know that because I've been told it by a person who personally had that experience. And he was listened to for 3/4 of an hour, which, believe me, from a Cardinal Archbishop anywhere is pretty good going. To listen to an individual. So, he's, I know he has a reputation as very conservative, but hey, there's something there. What we can do with it, I don't know. That's up to you, but there's something there. Many bishops are or have been sexually active and have been blackmailed by other sexually active clerics. This has prevented such bishops from acting as real shepherds in support of those who are sexually abused. How can this be constructively addressed? The bishop who has been sexually active, firstly, has abused. I'm not just talking about children here, I'm talking about, say, adult women. There's still such a disparity of power between the two that it's hard to avoid the term abuse, and it is at the very least not so much the violation of a vow, that would worry me less, but the violation of a pastoral responsibility. You cannot be a priest again to a person if you've had a sexual relationship with that person. You've changed it forever. If they're being blackmailed, there's only one way, one path for that bishop to go, and that is to resign. There's no other. Sorry, there isn't. And that's what he needs to do. He'll never be an effective bishop again if that's, the blackmail is hanging over his head like that. I can't see it anyway. Resolved. The discipline of celibacy of priests should be amended. The question is how do progressively minded Catholics counter the argument that the Church would have to subsidise financially any spouses and children of priests who are allowed to marry. Well, they'd have to. I've looked at celibacy tonight solely in terms of abuse. I'm saying that it has been a contributing factor because it has contributed to unhealthy psychology, unhealthy ideas, and unhealthy living conditions. That's where true spirituality lies. Well, maybe we need to look at celibacy again in that light. So there are a number of reasons for looking at celibacy. Tonight I've concentrated only on the one concerning abuse. As regards the financial costs of having a married clergy, hey, if we really want something healthy, we're going to have to pay some money for it. If there's a good service being given, people will pay for it.
Get what you pay for.
So I really wouldn't be concerned about it. There's one more. This is the last one?
Yep.
This is the last one. Many bishops are... Oh no, that's the...
Now you're ready.
Yes, it said that such a bishop would really need to resign. I can't see any other way to go. Not if he's been sexually, he has abused, and he's been blackmailed. Gosh, right? To me, you'd have to resign.
Bishop Geoffrey has said that he would be in the back of the, where the tables are, just outside the door, and we will be willing to sign any books if you would like to. So when you leave, you can do that, and you can talk them out.